The Accidental Elopement, written and read by Beverly Oakley. Chapter 1. Katherine wasn't usually frightened of the dark, and certainly not when she could still hear the strains of the lively polka she was supposed to be dancing with George. However, as she felt her way along the dark corridor behind the ballroom of Lady Braxton's London townhouse and the sounds of the orchestra grew fainter, some of the courage for which Katherine was renowned drained away. For a moment she contemplated turning back. However, returning to the dancing meant she'd have no choice but to partner her dreadful cousin, and Katherine would rather frighten herself half to death in a deserted corridor than do that. Except she soon found to her dismay that it wasn't deserted. When she stumbled over a large, unidentified object and landed with a painful jarring of her wrists upon the cold, hard flagstones, Katherine was sure she was about to be kidnapped by pirates and would never see any of her loved ones ever again. Then she remembered she was a young lady about to make her debut, and no longer a child who harboured fanciful notions of pirates. "Good Lord!" came a disembodied young male voice in the dark before a groping hand located a piece of Katherine, a carefully arranged ringlet of hair, which caused her to shriek even louder when it was quite unnecessarily tugged. Whether or not this was to establish who or what she was, she had no idea, and perhaps neither did the tugger, for immediately a profound apology was issued before the groping hand was operating with complete abandon in the dark. It found Katherine's breast just as the voice said in tones of utter mortification, "Forgive me, are you hurt? Take my hand, really, I can't apologize enough." Katherine had made one unsuccessful attempt to stand, but it was a struggle in her flounced skirts and multiple petticoats. She swatted away the supposedly helping hand and hissed something unintelligible, since unladylike language seemed less of an offence when she couldn't see to whom she was speaking. But when the disembodied groping hand entered her orbit once more, in fact brushing the bare flesh above her garter and getting in a good squeeze of her thigh, her temper, which had never been one of her strong points, snapped, and she lashed out with a sharp slice through the inky air. A loud yelp made her realize she'd perhaps been a little peremptory and certainly too violent in this unladylike action, and even though she felt disinclined to apologize, she did say ungraciously, "I'm sorry I hit you, but a lady can only take so much of all this groping in the dark. I mean, what were you doing?" "I could ask you the same thing," came the response, now at ear level. In fact, she could feel the soft whisper of breath against her cheek, which made her step back, saying, "I asked first." "I was chasing a cat," came the voice. "Bending down, in fact, and then suddenly something crashed into me. Or on top of me." "That was me." "There's no one else here, is there?" Katherine bridled at his tone. She was unused to being found at fault. "Then how thoughtless it was of you to crouch down where anybody could simply crash into you." The response was whip-fast and enragingly superior. "Anybody, or rather anybody else, would be carrying a candle. I think I have every reason to be deeply suspicious of the motives of anyone who is not." "Well, you don't have a candle," said Katherine, "and I would suspect the truth of anyone hiding away in the dark, claiming they were crouching over an imaginary cat," huffed Katherine, smoothing her skirts. "In fact, I'd wager there was no cat here at all. No, you were sneaking away from something, weren't you?" "And if I was, what business is it of yours, whoever you are?" Katherine could not imagine the audacity. "I could ask the same question," she said. "You certainly are no gentleman to speak to a lady in that fashion." "Since that lady hasn't bothered to introduce herself," came the reply, "I think I could be forgiven." "A gentleman would have introduced himself first," Katherine said hotly. "What were you sidling away from? There's a noisy ball going on in the next room. If you were a gentleman, wouldn't you be gallantly asking the ladies to dance instead of hiding in the dark?" "Perhaps there's someone you're afraid of seeing," A lady who has expectations of you behaving towards her as a gentleman would." Katherine said this triumphantly before elaborating on her theme. "My guess is that you've given some poor young lady the idea that you'll dance with her all night. And now you've changed your mind and are sneaking away." "And I'd suggest," returned the voice, "that you're trying to sneak away from a gentleman to whom you've already promised 2 dances. Meanwhile he, poor fellow, is searching for you vainly in the ballroom, while you're here making a mockery of him." "He can do that all by himself," Katherine sniffed. "But I never promised him anything, and I never will." "Ha! I was right." The anonymous young gentleman sounded very pleased with himself. "Well, I feel sorry for this chap without even seeing what you look like, miss. Poor fellow." "Poor fellow indeed. George can pine till the cows come home. I'd even suffer talking to you than have to spend another 5 minutes with his sweating hands squeezing mine, and his cow eyes boring into me, and his horrible, putrid breath choking me, and his—" "Poor George," remarked her unseen companion. "I was just starting to feel sorry for him until you described the exact George I, too, am so at pains to avoid tonight." The voice became more confidential and the mood relaxed. "Well, you have described my cousin to a very fine point." Katherine laughed. "And if you are as well acquainted with him as you seem to be, then you obviously know exactly why I am here in the dark." There was a small silence, and then, "Your cousin?" "Yes, my cousin George." "George who?" "Lord Quamby's son. Lord Quamby is married to my Aunt Antoinette, who's the sister of my mother, who—" "I know exactly who you're talking about, and we're talking about the same George." The voice sounded stunned. A quick gasp from both of them was followed up by a delighted cry in unison. "Jack!" "Katherine!" Katherine laughed at the ludicrousness of it. "I can't believe it's really you, Jack!" When the seeking hand came in contact with her cheek, Katherine gripped his wrist to hold it in place as she raised her hand to feel for his face. Of course, it was terribly unladylike behaviour, and had there not been the mantle of darkness lending their reunion such an air of reality, she'd not have been nearly so forward. But with their hands on respective cheeks and around waists, such a greeting seemed quite natural. "I can't believe it's you, Jack. I haven't seen you for 5 years, and I certainly didn't expect to see you tonight." "That's because my mother is visiting Quamby House, but as we arrived late, she decided to remain at home while I said I needed activity after the long drive." "Mamma said nothing about you coming. I knew she was expecting visitors. And I do remember her mentioning your parents, but then she said you'd not be accompanying them, so I lost interest, and in fact didn't even consider the visit might be this weekend." "You lost interest? Do you mean you were interested before?" he asked. "Of course," Katherine laughed. "I wanted to see if I could still make you do whatever I told you to, now that you're grown." He laughed too. Katherine had been notorious for sending Jack on all sorts of errands when he was just the foundling child visiting Quamby House before he was adopted by the well-to-do Eliza and Rufus Patmore. Katherine and Jack had spent a great deal of time together as children, before Jack had left the district with his parents. Katherine's last visit to Patmore Farm had been when she was 12. "Really?" he said. "Is that what you thought?" "I could always make you do what I wanted you to, Jack." She heard the edge of wickedness to her tone and tensed in expectation of having her hair pulled. There'd been a lot of chasing and tumbling on the ground when Katherine had been 7 and Jack 8. Even during that last visit when she'd been on the cusp of adolescence, seeing Jack again was like having a lamp turned on, warming the little heart that was in danger of becoming too caught up with adult cares. Jack chuckled. "You'll never know if you could make me do whatever you wanted me to if you don't ask me now, will you?" "Are you daring me?" "Of course." Katherine thought. She ran her hand over his cheek, the pads of her fingers keenly attuned to the light dusting of stubble. Then she slowly contoured his jawline. She felt him shudder slightly, though he didn't move. With a flat hand, she gently contoured his shoulder line. It was a broader shoulder than she remembered. The cloth of his well-cut coat was smooth and rough at the same time, and she felt the sharp line of his collar. He seemed to hold himself rigid, rapt. She was sure a small sigh of disappointment escaped him when she removed her hands. "All right, but you must promise you will do as I say, before I tell you what you must do." She felt his breath in the cold air between them, and her mouth stretched into a smile of anticipation as she waited for him to reply. Jack had been her willing slave, fulfilling her every demand with the utmost good humour, until he'd reached a point where he'd declare his chivalry was at an end, and she could ask until the cows came home. But he'd not pick another apple, or climb to the highest branch of the fir tree at the bottom of the garden of Cornby House before his next visit from the foundling home. "I'm afraid I'm old enough and wise enough to no longer agree to carry out promises that are not reasonable ones. You taught me a lot, Katherine, including that I must be wary of what I promise. Otherwise I could end up plunging my hand into a basket of spiders or a hornet's nest." "I never made you thrust your hands into a hornet's nest." Katherine was indignant. "But you did have me thrust my hands into a basket full of spiders. I do remember that." Katherine remembered it well. It had been at the pinnacle of her power when she was 8 and Jack was going through a stage of wanting to prove how brave and strong he was. This was just after the Patmores had adopted him. "All right. What if I promised that my request would be something I knew would be good for you? What if I said that, like you, I'm no longer a foolish child, but an adult of good sense who would only order you to do something that I knew you would not regret or cause you harm?" The considering tone came again. "Yet you want me to first of all promise you that I will do the thing you request of me." "Yes, I've never done you harm, so it's not an unreasonable request, is it?" "Knowing you as I do, Katherine, it's not unreasonable at all, and taking very large risks is something I pledged I'd always be prepared to do for you, right from when I was a boy. You know I've always been your slave, fair Katherine, so yes, I will promise to carry out this request, or at least attempt to. And now I wait in anticipation to hear what it is, even if it means going back into the ballroom and being chums again with young George, which I know he should be. He's not a bad fellow, but tonight I think he's out of his depth. He doesn't know how to behave when he's all at sea, and then he becomes quite ridiculous." "I won't send you back to George." Katherine smiled into the dark, her heart starting to hammer as she considered the very big request she was about to make of him. It hadn't occurred to her until just this moment. But the intimacy between them, based as it was on a lifelong friendship, didn't make it seem outrageous in the slightest. "I want you to kiss me." "Kiss you?" He laughed. "That's very brazen. Can I first ask why? You haven't seen me for 5 years. I might have ghastly spots all over my face, and lost my front teeth, and likely caused shivers of revulsion to run down your spine. If you were observing me in the lamplight right now, why, I might even be more unprepossessing than young George." "I don't think that's possible. But have you?" "What?" "Got spots all over your face." "I'm not going to tell you. That'll mean you're the one taking all the risks. I've just warned you of the potential dangers, and now you have to think the worst while I kiss you, so that you can hold firm to your dignity and control your horror when we both get into the light again." Before Katherine had a chance to reconsider, she felt the tips of his fingers lightly brush her cheeks before he cupped her face. Her breath caught in her throat, while the blood rushed to her head, causing pins and needles along the way. Too intrigued by her body's alien responses, she wasn't going to back out now. After a second's agonizing anticipation, his lips gently touched hers. It was as if 1,000 butterflies had been unleashed in the dark. Katherine was enthralled. This was much nicer than she'd expected. Jack's young, strong body felt like the rock of sanctuary in the darkness. When she'd felt as out of her depth in the ballroom as Jack had just suggested George felt, she twined her arms behind Jack's neck, eager to deepen the kiss as his tongue gently breached the seam of her lips. He smelt nice, of pepper and sandalwood soap, overlaid by the familiar smell that was just him. Katherine shivered, opening her mouth wider as the sensory delight grew more intense. Too soon he stopped, and with a sigh, Katherine sagged slightly as he drew back, his hands clasping hers and squeezing them in the dark. "You did that so well," she told him approvingly. "Have you done it much before?" "A few times." He paused. "But I never enjoyed it as much as this time." "Is it very different kissing different people?" she asked. "You've never kissed anyone, I take it." "No, that's why I asked you to do it, so I'd know what to expect." "I'm going to London in a month to be presented. And Mamma and Aunt Antoinette have been drilling me like sergeant majors on how to make the most of myself in order to make the best match I can." "You always were ambitious, my dear Katherine." There was something about the way he used the familiar term that made her feel quivery all the way down to her feet. "I just know what I'm worth." She said it in a proud, haughty tone, but she was smiling. "That's what Aunt Antoinette says I must think every time I weigh up an offer," she giggled. "You'd remember my aunt, of course." "Lord, how could I forget the redoubtable, scandalous Lady Quamby? Your mother and her sister were the Ton's reigning beauties." "And don't you dare suggest in front of them that they're anything less today," Katherine teased. "As a gentleman, I am well versed in tact." "You always were. And now I really should return, else Mamma will tear strips off me. I've been gone far too long as it is." She put her hand on the cold, plastered wall and half-turned. "Are you coming?" "I think I'll make my departure now," he said, "and find a hackney to take me to Quamby House. I expect I'll find Mamma will still be up playing cards with the Earl. He was very delighted to see her again. And not the slightest bit disappointed that Uncle Rufus couldn't accompany her. Lots of stories to share." He paused. "Unless you'd like me to return to the ballroom with you." Katherine considered, then shook her head, even though she knew he couldn't see her. "No, I'll go alone. You can be my special secret. I'd rather no one knew we'd stumbled upon each other here in the dark. When we meet back at Quamby House tonight." His soft chuckle followed her as she groped her way back to the bright lights of the ballroom, and it sustained her with a happy internal glow as young George's face lit up when he encountered her at the supper table. "You look very pleased with yourself, Katherine," he remarked, touching her elbow. "Anticipating the final dance of the evening with me?" Katherine sighed, but kept her smile in place. "All right, George, if that'll please you." Her lips were still thrumming with pleasurable delight at the memory of Jack's kiss, But now the idea of being in George's cloying waltz-hold would remind her of how important it was to find herself a husband who made her feel the excitement and pleasure Jack's touch inspired, rather than the weary resignation she felt being with George. Chapter 2. Katherine wasn't sorry when it was time to leave the ball, but it was only a country affair, she supposed. London would be so much more exciting. "Darling, you weren't very kind to Cousin George when you haven't seen him in such a long time," Katherine's mother said under her breath as she followed her daughter and sister into the carriage, tucking aside her blue skirts as the door was closed. The gentlemen, who had stayed on to finish their game of cards, would be coming later in the barouche. "Oh, it takes much more than plain speaking for George to get the message," Aunt Antoinette said breezily as she arranged her voluptuous, shapely frame against the far side of the carriage. She smiled as she toyed with the feathers of her headdress. "My poor son can be rather a buffoon when he's had a couple too many, as he clearly has had tonight." Katherine shot a glance at her aunt to see if she were funning or perhaps taking offence on George's account. This was Katherine's first visit in a year to Bath to stay with her aunt and Lord Quamby at their home a short distance away. But her last was memorable for making her debut at the Assembly Rooms. There, a gentleman had asked Aunt Antoinette if she were Katherine's sister, declaring her a golden-haired manifestation of Katherine. The remark had delighted Aunt Antoinette, shocked Katherine, and prompted her mother to use it as an example of why her daughter should not be trusting of any gentleman who were only after one thing. This cryptic phrase, with no elaboration, had been confusing, but the incident had made Katherine more observant of her aunt, who seemed to lead her life as if it were one great big adventure, with nothing more important than drinking champagne and being feted by gentlemen. "Antoinette, you mustn't speak about the boy like that in front of Katherine," her mother now said before asking briskly, "And did you see any handsome gentleman whose acquaintance you'd like to further, Katherine?" Her aunt interrupted with a laugh. "Bearing in mind they must also have a nicely plump pocket-book. Such a sighting would save your parents the cost of your London season." She laughed again, adding, "You'd be very welcome to remain here and further any acquaintance you desire, as long as they are quite of the upper 500. Or, since your mamma declares she wants you to follow your heart, the upper 1000. Lady Fenton ignored her sister, her gaze still focused on Katherine. "Darling, I am being serious. Did you meet anyone? And don't listen to your aunt. You know your father and I want you to wed only when your heart is properly engaged." Katherine played with her reticule while she formed a careful answer, for her mind was filled with thoughts of Jack. "No, Mamma, I didn't see anyone." "So it's off to London in a week, then," declared Aunt Antoinette gaily. "I'm so glad. I'd have hated to be deprived of my fun in the metropolis." Katherine let her mother and aunt converse on either side of her while she continued to dream of the young man she'd not seen, but with whom she'd shared such an exciting kiss in the dark. It had been as pleasurable and as exciting as she'd imagined it would be, though she was aware the sensations might have been heightened by its illicit edge. When the carriage drew to a halt in front of the portico of Quamby House, where she and her parents would stay until they travelled to London, her heart suddenly began skittering around her chest cavity. It was silly, she berated herself, because she'd known Jack for years. Admittedly, when she'd last seen him, they'd initially been wary of each other, until one of the Earl's dogs had gone missing. During the subsequent search, however, they'd re-established the old rapport, daring each other to more outrageous exploits, balancing on overturned tree trunks to cross streams, and climbing overhanging tree branches. They'd been filthy when they'd returned, but very happy, the bonds of old friendship fully restored. "Come along, Katherine, don't keep everyone waiting." Her mother was by the carriage while Aunt Antoinette was already being admitted through the double doors. "The Patmores are here already. Please be kind to Jack. You treated him so abominably as a child, as I recall, but do remember he's officially adopted. He's not the foundling boy you had at your beck and call when you were younger." That was what her mother thought, Katherine mused as she followed her inside. Jack would always be at her beck and call. Why else would she like him so much? Annoyed to find her heart positively racing by the time she neared the drawing-room door, she wondered why, since she was neither embarrassed nor feeling ashamed of her behaviour with Jack. She supposed it was because Jack had entered into the experiment with his usual good humour. And that's what it had been, an experiment, not a romantic adventure. "Why, Katherine, you've turned into quite the beauty," declared Eliza Patmore, as Katherine curtsied demurely in front of her and her husband. Although Katherine had been aware of the young man beside them, who had risen at her entrance, she hadn't yet ventured a look in his direction. "Thank you, Mrs. Patmore," she murmured before turning slightly and inclining her head. "And you must be Jack." Suddenly her heart was in her mouth and hammering like a tin drum, though she kept her voice level and cool. "So nice to see you again." He was nothing like the 13-year-old she remembered. The feel of his jawline and the touch of his lips in the dark had provided no inkling of what he'd look like when under scrutiny. His hair was the light, curling brown she remembered, but his lips were a more interesting shape. They were curved into a smile now, his sparkling eyes boring into hers as if he were sharing a private joke with her. Except that she wasn't ready to enter into the fun. In fact, she wasn't sure what to think, for she'd always had the upper hand. And yet now, Jack Patmore was no longer the poor boy with no family. He was a young, handsome man of good standing. "Did you not recognize me?" he asked. Yes, she recognized him, but there was a jaunty confidence that was nothing like she'd expected. Of course he'd always been easy-natured. Katherine had had a hard time whipping up his anger when she'd played a childish prank on him. For the most part, though, she'd co-opted him into hijinks that had cook running after them waving her wooden spoon, or Nanny shrieking with terror at a mouse the children had dropped into her work basket. So, while Katherine had never seen Jack lose his temper, she'd not expected he'd be so at ease in these surroundings. Yes, that's what it was. He was the fortunate boy who'd been allowed a taste of the good life at Quamby House. He was supposed to be grateful and subservient, but now he was smiling and acting as if he were Katherine's equal. It irritated her. Yes, that was the feeling that was niggling at her, she decided. Irritation. "Why, I barely recognized you," she said, "for it's been a long time since I saw you." "Yes, a very long time." He frowned. "When did I last see you?" 5 years ago," she said quickly. 5 years ago. That's a very long time. Surely we've bumped into one another since then?" She felt the warmth in her cheeks. She who never blushed. "Yes, 5 years ago I saw you, when I was 12, she said airily. It was ridiculous, but she suddenly couldn't think of anything the least bit clever or lively to say. The look he sent her was wicked, but Katherine was not going to pretend to share the humour. Of course she shouldn't have kissed him in the dark. She'd thought herself terribly clever, but now she felt she'd played into his hands. "We're unleashing Katherine on local society," said her aunt, "so she doesn't embarrass her poor parents when she goes to London. Isn't that right, Fanny?" Her aunt appealed to her sister, waving at the servant to pour the claret. "When have I ever embarrassed them before?" Katherine retorted, gaining courage and taking a glass of claret before her father plucked it from her hands, saying, You may have attended your first ball, but this is for grown-ups, my dear." "Papa, I might be married in a month." "That would be working fast, my dear," said Aunt Antoinette. "Even faster than your mother when she was unleashed on London society all those years ago. Not that she was distinguished by her speed, more her tenacity and daring. It took her a full 2 seasons to snare Hanson Fenton." Antoinette flashed a smile at her brother-in-law before greeting her son, who'd just walked into the room. "George, you've returned at last. Say hello to Jack. It's been a long time since you've seen him." "You were at the ball." George pointed an accusing finger at Jack as he ran a chunky, ring-adorned hand through his fashionably curled hair. "As soon as you saw me, you disappeared. It was you, wasn't it?" Jack looked innocent. "Good Lord, how rude of me. Was that you coming towards me? Truth is, I lost my nerve when I found myself surrounded by strangers." He sent the other youth a disarming smile. "Every young lady in that room seemed to look down her nose at me, so I decided to beat a hasty retreat. If I'd known it was you, George, I'd have asked you to introduce me to some people. Maybe someone whom I could have asked to dance." George pursed his lips and swiveled his eyes between Jack's earnest face and his mother's smiling approval. Won over by the fact that Jack appeared to look up to him, he said reassuringly, "Course I would have, Jack. I always stuck up for you when we were children. Don't know what you'd have done without me looking out for you, if the truth be told." "I don't know either," Jack agreed. George stuffed his thumbs into his waistband. "Cousin Katherine was forever planning something devious to shame you, Jack, just because you were an orphan." He jutted out his jaw and looked collaboratively at Jack before frowning at Katherine and saying, upon a sigh, "The number of times I stopped her from tormenting you when you had no one." "Yes, yes, George, I'm sure we all remember those days," his mother interrupted, fanning herself. "But let's turn the topic to the plans for fun and excitement we've devised for our guests here the next few days. I expect you to be on your best behaviour and to be the perfect host. We don't want poor Katherine rushing off to London thinking she couldn't have escaped fast enough." Aunt Antoinette smiled at Jack. "And your presence will be much appreciated, Jack, because we've hired a dancing master for Katherine. Only George says he won't dance. So I hope you don't mind." "I will dance," George objected. "You said you'd refuse, darling, because you had more important things in town and you'd be leaving tomorrow." George rolled his shoulders. "Well, I've changed my mind," he muttered. "That was before I met Katherine again after so long and realised how grateful she'd be to have a dancing partner. I'm not about to shirk my duties as host while Katherine and Jack are here. Not when it could be just like the wonderful old days." And as Katherine glanced between George and Jack, she felt she really was returning to those wonderful old days where Jack was her ally and friend, and teasing George promised to be so much fun. Chapter 3. The wonderful old days had been anything but wonderful as far as Jack was concerned. Life at the foundling home was Spartan, and survival depended on charming the wardens and being a step ahead of the children who would snitch or steal for an extra spoonful of gruel. The only wonderful highlights of Jack's years from infancy to when he was 8 years old were his thrice-weekly visits to Quamby House. The supervisor at the foundling home had told Jack a permanent position as a boot boy might be in the offing. However, the Earl and his Countess, who seemed to him like genial royalty, insisted that Jack must play. Jack soon learned that the words work and play were interchangeable. Jack's job was to play with the Earl's son, George, a large, lumpish, spoiled and self-absorbed boy who was only a child and needed a playmate. Apparently, in the eyes of Lord and Lady Quamby, This constituted work, as their son was, they told him, not an easy boy. George had been resistant at first, and had Jack feeling disinclined to court the society of a child who was so unappreciative of his good fortune. But Jack soon learned that trailing the bigger boy was an assured way of getting lots of good food. Unaccountably, the cook formed a fondness for Jack, and never did he return to the foundling home without a covered basket full of treats he would share with the other children, thus shoring up his power and popularity there. Not that Jack had sought power for any other reason than to get enough to eat, but now that he was 18 and would soon be proving himself in the West Indies, he realized his early days had provided useful training in understanding how children and adults manipulated one another for different objectives. George was clearly keen to impress Katherine and prove his dominance over Jack, just like the old days, so it was easy to slip back into the old patterns that had worked in the past. Maturity, of course, altered matters a little. Katherine was conscious of her blossoming beauty, he could see, while George remained as unaware of external forces as he had ever been. Chief amongst these pleasures was eating, though it appeared he'd suddenly discovered a passion for dancing, and squiring Katherine in a polka or waltz was, he declared, an important cousinly duty. "She's quite green, so she'll need a bit of dash if she's to carry it off on the dance floor," he told Jack the morning after Jack's arrival at Quarmby House. "And you're just the man to ensure she shows herself to advantage," Jack responded as they tucked into the peach tart cook had made. Jack was touched that the old dear had remembered it used to be Jack's favourite. "So, George," he said, "you're the counterpoint to her grace, charm and elegance, then." "The counterpoint, yes," George repeated, leaning back in his chair in the conservatory, though he sounded a little uncertain as to what Jack actually meant. "She appears so vibrant when she's next to you," Jack went on. "You're bringing out her best." George seemed to like this, before asking if Jack would care to observe from the sidelines how he executed his clever moves on the dance floor with Katherine. With a smug grin, he added that he wasn't one to keep his tricks to himself, and in view of their long friendship, he'd be pleased to teach Jack everything he knew. So now, Jack was reclining on a red velvet-upholstered sofa he dragged into the vast, empty ballroom, and was nodding approval as George swung Katherine round and round the room to a less than perfect piano accompaniment. Almost perfect in Jack's eyes, however, was Katherine, whose transformation from a spirited 12-year-old to a beautiful and self-assured young woman was almost complete. He didn't think she could be any lovelier, and he still couldn't get over that he'd shared his first proper kiss with her the night before in the dark. He'd kissed girls before, though he decided these didn't count since none of the consequent effects had been remotely like the incendiary response he'd experienced with Katherine. Not that Katherine appeared to consider it an earth-shattering experience. In fact, she'd been making it quite clear all day that their sensuous encounter in the dark had been nothing more than a piece of fun for her. At breakfast, she'd tossed her elaborately plaited and braided hair and raised her nose to the ceiling when Jack had said good morning, murmuring that she hadn't been up long enough to tell. Jack wondered if the fact she wasn't able to look him in the eye was because she was embarrassed, or if she really did think herself superior. Her attitude amused him, which was why he dragged the old red velvet sofa into the ballroom. Watching so slavishly from the sidelines would surely annoy her. And clearly it did. After the third time that Jack complimented George on his technique and criticised Katherine on hers, she snapped. "Maybe you should try for yourself, Jack, instead of offering everyone else good advice," she suggested. "I was just offering you good advice," Jack said innocently. "Not everyone." "Oh, so George doesn't need improvement, but I, who am to be launched in less than 5 days, have a long way to go. That's what you inferred, Jack, and don't you deny it. Are you so perfect that you've never stepped on anyone's toes?"
"I wouldn't dare try what George is doing," Jack said hastily. "The man's a cream puff in trousers, and I'm nowhere near the expert he is. I'd only show what a clumsy oaf I am by comparison." "Go on then, try," George dared him, dropping his hands from about Katherine's waist and shoulders and signalling for Jack to take his place. "Though what you say is true. Many a young lady, and not so young, has complimented me on how well I take the lead, while ensuring she has such a pleasurable experience." He glanced at Katherine as if to gauge the effectiveness of his words. And Jack caught Katherine's secret eye roll as she tilted her face to glance at her new partner. A moment of shared hilarity reverberated through them as Jack rose and took George's place, truncated with great effect by Jack's loud objection that Katherine had started before the proper beat. "Do you really have 2 left feet, Jack?" Katherine said crossly as he pulled her closer to him, pretending to try and keep his balance. Together they lurched about the dance floor until the music finished, after which Katherine threw up her hands and declared, "You'd have to be the worst dancer I've ever had the misfortune to partner." "Jack, old chap, do watch more closely,"
George admonished as he returned to squiring Katherine about. "But just for this one last dance," warned Katherine. "My feet are bruised all over from Jack stepping on my toes, but George is such an athlete it quite takes my breath away." "Really, George, with the pace you set, I truly can only manage one more dance." Outside, alone together, as George had reluctantly answered a summons from his uncle, Jack and Katherine had to hurry behind the broad trunk of an old oak tree before they collapsed into laughter. "Goodness, did you see how smug George looked when I called him an athlete?" Katherine giggled.
"And how he loved to put me in my place,"
Jack replied. "George is so easy to manage if he thinks he has the upper hand." Katherine wiped the tears of laughter away from her face with the back of her hand and, still breathing rapidly, said, "Do you say you'll come to London with us? George is coming, and I don't think I can bear even a week staying at Uncle Quamby's townhouse if it's just George and me. Didn't your mamma say it was a possibility?"
"A possibility, but one already discounted," Jack said, feeling disappointed. "I board my ship for the West Indies in 10 days, and I'd decided to forego London and return home to pack."
"Then change your plans."
The way Katherine looked so imploringly up at him decided Jack in an instant. He shrugged. "All right, I will. Mamma and Uncle will be in London in any case, though I can only stay a couple of days before the house is overrun with the Hampshire cousins."
"Then you can stay at Uncle Quamby's townhouse, I'm sure."
Jack saw that her suggestion was genuine. "In that case," he said, "we'll all go to London. It'll be grand."
Chapter 4. "So, I have day dresses, 2 Spencers, 2 walking dresses, 3 shawls, 1 opera cloak, 4 pairs of dancing slippers, 1 pair of walking boots, 3 bonnets." Katherine broke off her inventory to greet her aunt while her maid laid out each item of her lavish wardrobe on the bed before folding it to put away in the wardrobe. "Aren't I going to be the best-dressed debutante in all of London, Aunt Antoinette?"
Katherine was feeling remarkably chipper this morning, despite the hour at which she'd returned from her very first London ball. After their day of travelling between Bath and London, they'd only reached Mayfair at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, and Mamma had said that of course it was too late to look in at Lady Edison's Assembly Ball. However, Katherine had had her way, partly because the Patmores had already arrived, and Jack had turned up on their doorstep with all the encouragement needed, which wasn't much. For Mamma was tired and Jack was persuasive, saying his own Mamma hoped very much for Katherine's company, which was all it took to make a compelling case. It had been entirely worth everything. Aunt Antoinette had accompanied her to last night's ball, naturally, though Katherine suspected her aunt had her own scheme.
For the evening already laid out if the warmth of Aunt Antoinette's familiar greeting of a young man, considerably younger than herself, who had then paid her a great deal of attention all evening, was anything to go by. Katherine had only been to London once, and she'd been too young to dance, though she'd attended a few quiet house parties. This was different, though. She was officially out, a debutante, and it only took last night to realize she was a popular one. This, it transpired, was the reason for her aunt's visit to her bedchamber now. Aunt Antoinette draped herself across a chair she pulled at right angles to the bed, looked at the selection of clothes and accessories, and said, "I think my favourite is the crimson silk." Katherine frowned. "Of course I shall wear the pale blue naturally, since Mamma will be accompanying me." Her aunt nodded approvingly. "Of course, your Mamma was such a wicked girl in her day, but now that she has her own daughter, she is as overprotective as a mother hen." Katherine rubbed the side of her nose, not quite thinking this an appropriate analogy, though it was true that her mamma had shown herself surprisingly cautious and occasionally critical about the way Katherine conducted herself in public. She sat down at her dressing table and picked up a rabbit's foot brush. "I can't believe the things you say about my mamma sometimes. About her being wild. She seems so proper." Katherine was fishing for more tidbits, it was true, but true also was the fact she found it hard to reconcile her mamma, devoted wife and mother who had eyes only for Katherine's papa, with the bold and beautiful debutante she'd learned had scandalized society with her antics. "Marriage has made her proper," said her aunt. "Marriage didn't make you proper," Katherine dared with a smile. She had always been aware that Aunt Antoinette was different, and that her marriage to the Earl of Quamby was different also, yet she still didn't quite understand it. "Oh, being proper is only for people who have to be," Aunt Antoinette said airily. "The ugly girls, the wallflowers, they can't get away with anything. Last night made it very clear you'll never fall into that category, my dear, which is why I've come to talk to you." Katherine straightened. "Goodness, that's very direct, Aunt." "Well, there's no point in fostering your ignorance and then regretting I'd not spoken to you earlier when it's already too late." "What's too late?" Katherine bent forward in alarm. "Nothing's too late, not now, but that's only because I'm speaking to you of matters your mamma wouldn't dream of bringing up with you, even though it's what's nearly caused her own downfall. And mine." Aunt Antoinette raised an eyebrow. "Well, aren't you going to quiz me?" Katherine blinked. "Wouldn't that be impolite?" she asked. "I was going to wait for you to tell me." "Oh, but you are a well-brought-up little miss. The trouble is, Katherine, one day you'll get caught by surprise with those feelings there," she said, directing a searching look at Katherine's bosom. "And there." She dropped her eyes lower. "You probably won't think to behave in any manner other than what your heart and body and those feelings direct you to. At least you won't if you're anything like your mother and myself. Which means, Katherine dearest, that it is my duty to explain to you the dangers of being under the control of love, passion, and desire. It's quite likely you'll entirely lose your head and throw caution to the wind, and then where would we all be if I hadn't warned you?" Katherine stared at her, puzzled. "Warned me? But you just did. About these feelings you say I'll feel when I fall in love. I felt some of them already, but they didn't make me lose my head. I certainly shan't make foolish decisions when it comes to choosing a husband. Why, it's my most important consideration now I'm in London." She added, as Miss Fenton, Katherine had a world of limitations placed upon her, but she'd seen how entirely different it was for the young matrons of her acquaintance to order their households and servants. And that's exactly what she couldn't wait to do. Aunt Antoinette let out a tinkling laugh. Oh, my dear girl, if it only were that easy. Do you really think you'll just fall in love with the right gentleman and get married? Katherine bit her lip. Georgiana Rice did, and so did Miss Marcia Heaslip, and Miss Juliana Macefield, and— Her aunt cut her off. Well, those are the girls you know who did what was expected of them, and good for them that it all went so swimmingly. If it did. Aunt Antoinette shrugged. But what if you fall in love with someone entirely disreputable? Like Cousin George, you mean? Asked Katherine. Aunt Antoinette snorted as Katherine clapped her hand to her mouth, saying, Forgive me, Aunt, it was very rude to speak like that about your son. When she saw that she'd caused Aunt Antoinette no offence, and in fact that her aunt appeared to endorse her feelings, she went on hesitantly. I meant Cousin George cultivates an air about him that is disreputable, but he's the last man I'd fall in love with. She thought a moment. I suppose you might mean someone like Mr. Marwick, who danced with me twice last night. Exactly. Aunt Antoinette gave a decisive nod, as if she'd been waiting for Katherine to mention his name. He is precisely the kind of gentleman I'm here to warn you about, and if you can't heed anyone's warnings, because let me assure you, your mamma will be on the warpath. Since Mr. Marwick is the nephew of a fellow she was secretly betrothed to, I shall have to advise you how to manage matters so you don't land up in the kind of trouble I did. Katherine put down the rabbit's foot powder brush and glanced at the door, praying her mother wouldn't choose this moment to enter. She knew Aunt Antoinette was the wilder of the two sisters, but her mother, though clearly reformed if her aunt had been truthful about the early days, seemed determined that her sister not spend too much time alone with her niece. What kind of trouble, Aunt? Katherine whispered. She knew it was death to a young lady's reputation to be unchaperoned when alone with a young man, though she'd never been entirely sure why, if kissing was the worst that could happen. If Aunt Antoinette could elaborate, it would be hugely helpful. The kind of trouble I worry about you getting into with a rake like Mr. Marwick, said her aunt. But I only danced with him twice, Aunt. And I saw the way his eyes followed you around the room, Katherine, for the entire evening. Believe me, he wants to do more than just dance with you. Katherine shivered with pleasure. She glanced at the red silk. Perhaps she would wear it after all. Mr. Marwick looked the kind of gentleman who would appreciate the bolder entrance she would make than if she wore the demure pale blue. You think he might want to marry me? She asked, and was surprised when Aunt Antoinette made a derisive snorting noise that did nothing to detract from her shining beauty and aplomb. There really was something of the ripe peach about her. Katherine had overheard those words used by more than one gentleman, and it was true that Aunt Antoinette looked rather exotic, with her golden ringlets escaping from the fashionable and elaborate style now in fashion. So, still thinking of this expression, she asked, Do you mean he regards me like a peach, ready for the plucking? Good Lord, where did you hear that term? Her aunt cried, looking both shocked and delighted as she twirled a ringlet around her finger. You overheard Lord Brentwood say that about me, didn't you? Such a nice gentleman. She sighed fondly before adding briskly, No, your beauty is different, and as you're an unknown quantity, you are a source of great fascination to a man like Freddie Marwick, as well as to his friend and rival, Lord Derry. So beware, Katherine, Mr. Marwick is the kind who'll take any opportunity to whisk you into a dark corner, or away from the hubbub, and you might think it thrilling at the time. Her aunt frowned heavily. But do not go anywhere alone with Mr. Marwick, for he is not a reputable gentleman. I've made inquiries, and for fear of making you do exactly the opposite of what I tell you, I must warn you about him. Katherine opened her mouth to protest that she had no intention of going into any dark corners with any gentleman, though she liked Mr. Marwick, who was charming and attentive, and indeed rather intriguing in a dangerous kind of way. But her aunt cut her off. Well, Katherine, if you do, and if matters proceed in a manner that is unwise, then know you can always come to me for help. Katherine was about to ask her to clarify what she could possibly mean, but her aunt rose and said decisively, "And that is all I have to say on the subject, for fear of your mamma boxing my ears for putting ideas into that pretty little head of yours." Katherine blinked. "Was that all you came to tell me?" "Absolutely. Beware of Mr. Marwick, but if you do something you regret, come to me rather than your mamma." Aunt Antoinette put her hand on the doorknob and was about to leave the room when Catherine's mamma swept in, a lovely smile making her even more of a beauty than her sister, Katherine thought in that moment. But then, while she was enormously fond of her aunt, she was devoted to her mother, despite their occasional differences of opinion. And as her mother seemed so very pleased with Catherine's choice of attire when she asked what Katherine wanted to wear to Lady Maxwell's that night, and so satisfied with the reports of her daughter's general conduct the previous evening, Katherine decided that her trip to London was going to be the most marvellous success. She'd make both her parents proud and be, herself, the happiest bride sometime during the next few months, she supposed, for there really was a vast array of choices, with seemingly every eligible gentleman in the land here in London for her to choose from. Mr. Marwick was dangerous and exciting, and clearly mad for her. Lord Derry was courteous and intense, and also clearly mad for her. Already she had 2 potential suitors, and that was only after her very first ball. Chapter 5. Katherine only realised what a sedate affair the previous evening had been when she and her parents were announced by Lord and Lady Maxwell's butler, in stentorian tones, to a vast assembly of guests. "You look very beautiful, my darling." Her father leaned over to whisper in her ear, "Now smile. It's not often I don't see that wicked glint in your eye, but I assure you, nobody's going to bite you." This made Katherine relax, and with a laugh the very first person to whom she was presented was, to her surprise, Mr. Marwick. "Ah, the exquisite Lady Fenton's equally lovely daughter," he murmured, kissing the back of her hand. "I am delighted." And indeed he really looked to be. His dark eyes sparkled, and his glossy moustache tickled in the most interesting way as it touched her flesh, sparking the sudden idea that it would be interesting to know what it felt like caressing her lips. Almost immediately she saw Jack, who was of course the only man she had kissed, and since Jack's presence had the effect of making her feel comfortable and at ease in this alien company, she didn't object when her mamma truncated Catherine's conversation with Mr. Marwick and steered her in the direction of her old friend, saying, "Jack, you look very dashing this evening. Won't you lead Katherine into the next dance? This is all very new to her, and with you I know she'll be in safe hands." Katherine couldn't resist a quick glance over her shoulder at Mr. Marwick before she surrendered herself to Jack. When she saw that the tall, slender gentleman with such dangerously alluring, saturnine looks was staring intently at her, heat burned her cheeks and her heart rate accelerated wildly. As their glances interlocked, he kissed the tips of her fingers and offered her a very elaborate bow. "I see you have a new admirer," Jack remarked as she turned back to him. His eyes were warm. "Not that I'm surprised. You're far and away the most beautiful girl in the room." Delight fizzed through Katherine, but before she could reply, Jack seized her hand and pulled her away. "Heavens, Jack, that's no way to manhandle a lady," she said crossly. "Sorry, your cousin George was making a beeline for you, and I thought you'd feel safer on the dance floor with me and out of his orbit." "Well, if it's a choice of having you step all over my toes or to have to suffer George's arms around me, I don't know what I'd choose," Katherine grumbled. But it wasn't long before she was tipping up her face to say admiringly, "You're actually quite a marvellous dancer, Jack. You haven't stepped on my toes once."
Oh, that was all an act for George. Surely you knew that.
But you were so convincing.
Of course, a foundling home lad only survives through pretending to be whatever is required at the time.
His grip tightened about her waist, and he drew her closer as they negotiated a manoeuvre between a couple who'd left them little space. Katherine reflected that while it was wonderful to be admired by Mr. Marwick, everything about the London social whirl was rather daunting. Being in Jack's arms seemed to give her the breathing space she needed. "And what is required of you tonight that you must pretend?" she asked playfully. He appeared to consider this.
"I must be a fine, upstanding gentleman, older than my years, if I am to compete with all the other rich, titled and experienced fellows currently admiring you throughout the room. And I must definitely not step on your toes in order to maintain your current high opinion of me, which I know will be in shreds the moment I say something to make you cross. I might look at my ease, but inside I'm quaking, walking on eggshells."
"Goodness, was I such an imperious child?" Katherine laughed as she was assailed by fond memories of those distant days. "Yet I don't recall that you were ever angry with me."
"I suppose I learned how to manage you, Katherine."
He shrugged.
"Like I managed the bigger, threatening boys at the home, using this."
He tapped his head.
"Rather than throwing my weight around. And the truth is, I really quite enjoyed doing your fetching and carrying, which I might add I only did because I wanted to."
"Wouldn't you do whatever I asked, even if you didn't want to?" she asked slyly. "You only do things that you want to? Is this your way of telling me you're a man of unyielding principle?"
He grinned. "I like to think so, though perhaps it's not yet been put to the test."
Becoming serious, he added, "Though it is something I intend to work on when I'm away. I don't want to be known as the foundling lad who was only able to make his mark through the support of his generous adoptive parents. I want to come home having made my fortune through my own efforts, and be known as a man of honour and principle." "Fine words indeed, but I can't bear the thought you're leaving in only 5 days. I will miss you, Jack."
"Will you really?"
Katherine glanced up, surprised at his tone and the intensity of her own feelings. She swallowed down the lump in her throat. "It was lovely having you there at Quamby House, and it would be so nice to have you here throughout the season as, well, a comforting presence as I—"
"Navigate the multitude of gallant offers from so many gallant men?"
Jack supplied for her.
"No, thank you. I don't think I could bear the jealousy."
"But here is the first of those gallant admirers, ready to seize his moment now that our waltz is over." He dropped his hands from Katherine's waist.
"Good evening, George. What a relief it will be for Katherine to swap her dance partner for one who really can dance."
Katherine flashed a colluding smile at Jack. "Really, I don't know how I'll be able to walk tomorrow," she said, looking pointedly at her feet.
George regarded them both gravely. "We can't all be good at everything."
He gripped Katherine's hand and pulled her into the centre of the dance floor.
"Let's show Jack how it's done, eh?"
Jack shook his head.
"I'll just bow out gracefully and see what other enticements are on offer. As it happens, I've spied a very pretty girl by the supper table who looks like she needs some company."
Katherine followed Jack with her gaze from over George's shoulder as he waltzed her about the room. She was surprised by the chagrin that welled up inside her as she saw the responsive smile the aforementioned very pretty young lady directed at Jack. Mr. Marwick, who was waltzing with a plain ginger-haired girl, passed them by. His glittering black eyes bored into hers, and his moustache twitched as he whispered, "Promise me you'll reserve the next dance for me." The thrill of being singled out by such a dashing gentleman, both rich and in line for a title, restored her spirits. Tonight, Katherine decided, she would make advances in properly assessing whom she'd consider a suitor. Aunt Antoinette's words had bolstered her confidence. She'd said Katherine could have her pick of the gentlemen, but Katherine needed to assess who was worthy. It was important to discover what it felt like to kiss a gentleman with a moustache before she furthered that acquaintance. What did it matter that she'd only met Mr. Marwick last night? After all, she had only a few weeks in London to make the most important decision of her life. She had to start somewhere. Surprisingly, her opportunity came earlier than expected, and immediately following her dance with Mr. Marwick, who'd held her thrillingly close. The unexpectedly soft brush of that magnificent moustache of his upon her jawline as he'd turned his head to point out something to her had caused her to jerk up her chin. His assessing gaze and the quirk of his lips told her he'd done it on purpose. She couldn't help herself, but her mouth turned up in secret acknowledgement, and her heart seemed to leap about as he increased the pressure of his hand around her waist. "Your mamma is nowhere to be seen, and I can't possibly leave you here alone," he remarked, glancing at the supper table on the other side of the room, then leading her in that direction, but hesitating as they approached. He scanned the room quickly, then said under his breath, "If you glide through that knot of people, there's a door into the passageway beneath the Holbein, and you won't be noticed, though it is a public door leading to the ladies' sewing room." Katherine glanced down at her gown, and he laughed. "Nothing torn. Everything in perfect order, in fact. But if you slip into the passage, I'll join you there in the shadows, so we might discuss our evening. We'll only be gone 30 seconds, and your mamma won't even notice." Katherine wasn't going to let this opportunity pass her by. She agreed with a quick nod, and within less than a minute she was in the dark passage and in Mr. Marwick's arms, the pair of them tucked behind an imposing coat of armour, while Mr. Marwick kissed her with haste and enthusiasm. Katherine sighed with pleasure. She'd enjoyed kissing Jack, and this experience was an interesting contrast. Her body was doing all the same things. Her heartbeat was growing more rapid, her skin felt heated, and there was an urgency all about her. But the moment he withdrew to take a breath, she wasn't visited by the urge to throw her arms about his neck once more and drag his mouth back to hers. He was a very adept kisser, and the experience was definitely worthwhile. But she certainly had some more research to do before she decided on her future husband. It was he who hurried her back into the throng once more, saying words that suggested that he was as concerned for his own reputation as for hers. But before he had the opportunity to remark upon their quick kissing tryst, which he was clearly about to do, for his eyes kindled as he lowered his head to hers, Katherine was nearly startled out of her wits by a familiar hand upon her upper arm, followed by a slight tug. Raising an indignant chin, she found Jack nodding at Mr. Marwick and thanking him for his attendance to Katherine on the dance floor. His manner indicated clear dismissal. Not that the older man was going to be fobbed off by such a greenhorn. At least that's the impression Katherine gained as the two regarded each other. "And who might you be?" Mr. Marwick asked, quite rudely, Katherine thought, wondering how Jack would describe himself. "Mr. Jack Patmore, Miss Fenton's proxy cousin," he replied. "My family accompanied hers to London and assigned me the duty of ensuring she was properly attended." Katherine liked that assessment. Yes, Jack was like a proxy cousin, stalwart and dependable and there to see to her interests. She wasn't at all disappointed when Mr. Marwick bowed in dismissal and left, she discovered. "What have you been up to, Miss Fenton?" Jack asked with mock severity. "Tell me, or I shall have to report to your mamma that you've lost one of the pearl earrings she lent you for this evening." Katherine put her hand to her earlobe with a gasp and grabbed Jack's hand. "It's in the passage just beyond. I have to fetch it. Come with me, Jack. Hurry!" She was panting with terror when she reached the door beyond. Jack stopped in the passageway when she dashed behind the coat of arms. "What were you doing with Mr. Marwick all the way up here, alone?" he asked. Katherine stepped back into view and met his censure with defiance, though the truth was she felt a little embarrassed having to admit the truth. "Really, Jack, it doesn't concern you, but since I've nothing to be ashamed of, I kissed him, or rather he kissed me, just like you did." She glanced nervously up the passage to where the door was quite likely to admit any visitor heading to the mending room. He gave her a considering look. And? And what? Katherine found herself. Returning to his side for the earring was not where she'd hoped to find it. It was very nice, actually. I liked the feel of his moustache. If he's going to be my husband, I'll want to know that I like it. Jack looked startled. But you only just met him. Clearly the reason he's in London is the same reason I am. She pushed back her shoulders. I've decided I need to kiss every man I think might be my husband. Naturally, I have to compare. Jack nodded, stroking his chin. Then he stared at the floor and took a few steps away. What are you doing? Looking for your earring, of course. Aren't you going to ask if I liked kissing Mr. Marwick as much as I liked kissing you? I'm not sure I want to. I liked kissing you very much. He straightened, his bright smile suddenly taking on a decisively sly cast. Do you not think that in order to make a truly considered assessment, you ought to kiss me one more time? Katherine met his look and shivered in anticipation. With Mr. Marwick's kiss fresh in her memory, Jack's suggestion sounded perfectly reasonable. Her gaze travelled the length of his long, lean legs and lingered on his mouth, and without saying a word, she stepped into his embrace, closing her eyes as a sweet, pleasurable sensation poured through her at the touch of his lips. His arms tightened about her, and she felt as if she were melting into him. He was more slender than Mr. Marwick, but of course at least 6 years younger, so that was hardly surprising. But she liked the strength of him, the width of his shoulders, and again she was flooded with happiness at memories of their long ago shared companionship. Until her body started to behave in a very strange manner, and suddenly the kiss seemed to only touch the surface of what she needed right now. Tiny prickles of sensation speared her all over, and there was the strangest roiling in her lower belly. As she deepened the kiss and ran her hands over his coat and down his back, she was delighted to hear his own breathing grow more laboured. Her breasts grew tingly, and she wished he would put his hands there, but he was ever the gentleman. Katherine's desire for exploration soon had her running her fingers through Jack's hair, contouring his waist, skimming his hips. But when her hand inadvertently came in contact with an unexpected swelling at the front of his trousers, she opened her eyes in surprise. He broke the kiss, stepping away quickly. Heavens, Katherine, you can't do that to a fellow, he protested, blushing furiously. Do what? What was I doing? And what was that? Katherine was confused, but before she could say any more, he gripped her wrist and pulled her after him, back towards the ballroom, which was just as thronged with people as before. And no one seemed to pay them any heed as they slipped past a group of gentlemen, loudly talking politics. There's your mamma. I'll leave you in her capable hands while I go back and look for your earring. Properly, this time, said Jack, and was gone before she could stop him.